welcome everybody, and thank you to Spiked for inviting me to chair this very important event with a fantastic lineup of speakers. We don't want to look at the intricacies of the Magna Carta or the battles between King John and the knights. We want to look at the impact of the Magna Carta, its ideals and its relevance today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they're going to be speaking. And we're going to start with John Holbrook on my left, who is a barrister and a regular contributor to Spiked, and can be relied upon to argue for fewer lawyers and fewer laws, maybe not to be expected from a lawyer, who's a lawyer himself. Last year he was shortlisted by the legal publisher Halsbury for its annual Legal Journalism Award, and this was for an article on the politics of law which was written in Spiked and also published elsewhere. Following John will be Dr. Frank Furedi, who's author of very many books and a broadcaster, and is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. He's written a number of books, including Authority, A Social History, and is currently working on a text, Taking Freedom Seriously. And last but not least, Jean Polisinski, who's flown all the way from America, so a special thanks to Jean. He's Chief Operating Officer at Museum Institute, the education and programs arms of Museum in Washington, D.C., and he directs the Institute's First Amendment Center. And he's a veteran journalist and writes a weekly column, Inside the First Amendment, which appears in more than 200 news outlets in the United States, and is host of the online interview program Journalism Works. The speakers will speak for 7 to 8 minutes each, after which I may pose some questions to them. We have a debate among the panel, and then it'll be open to questions and debate from you. John.
Thank you, Helena. I've come tonight with an infographic. I would call it a visual aid if it wasn't for the fact that I know that none of you will be able to read what it says. But fear not. The importance of this infographic is really the concept that lies behind it. As you can hopefully see, it's a timeline. It goes from 1215, and there at the top is a picture of a baron holding up his trusty sword of truth, liberty, and freedom. And then it comes through from the 17th century, 18th century, and here we come down to 1948. And all the events marked on here are well-known liberty-giving events that mark the struggle for freedom in Britain and America, also France in particular. So all of these events are well known to us and very important in terms of the extra rights and freedoms that they've given us. And then we come down to 1949, where we come to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then 1950, the European Convention on Human Rights. And then, if I turn over, there are more events that get me even more worried. So we come further down this infographic, and we come to the Equality Act of 2010, the Human Rights Act of 1998, and then we end up with the same-sex marriage legislation, which came into force last year. So there we have it, 800 years, supposedly, of liberty and freedom. But I have a real problem with this timeline, and it's simply this, because I think this timeline, the concept behind it is false. It's misleading, because whereas for the first 750 or so years of events which are shown on that infographic, it seems to me that they granted more liberty and more freedom. For the last 50 years, perhaps certainly the last 20, we can argue about exactly when the problem started, but for the last 20 or so years, it seems to me that the events shown on this timeline have not been concerned with liberty at all. They've been concerned with a different concept, namely the concept of rights. Now let me just explain what the difference is. Because obviously the liberties which are worth having can easily be, and in fact need to be, expressed as rights. So I'm talking here about the right of free speech, the freedom of the press, the right to vote, the right of free assembly, the right of freedom of conscience. All of those rights, it's very difficult to understand them without using the word right. But what we're really talking about there is a concept which means having personal autonomy, freedom from the state. I think that's the important point. It's about confining the state, which is very much what the barons in 1215 were trying to do, although the state was really just characterised then by the king. But nevertheless, you've got that concept starting in 1215. And so it continues through about 750 years of freedom. But then we come to the last 50 years, which, as I say, is more characterised by this concept of rights. Now, rights is a slippery concept, but to me, when people talk about rights now, they're talking about something very different from liberty. They are invariably talking about not freedom from the state, but protection by the state. And that, it seems to me, is the very important difference which this timeline misleads us into thinking doesn't exist. Let me just give you one example of that. So people, for example, will often talk about the right to die. Well, no one needs a right to die. Anyone can kill themselves or commit suicide if that's what they want to do. So when rights campaigners argue for the right to die and they take it into the Supreme Court, as they did last year, what the Supreme Court ends up doing is saying, well, we're interested in this idea of the right to die, but we think any right that a person should have to kill themselves should be regulated by the state. And that is just typical of the way in which the rights discourse these days ends up not seeking freedom from the state, but actually protection by the state. And the culture within which rights are now argued out, it seems to me, is very different from how liberty-giving events were understood in the past. It's possibly well understood by the campaigning organisation Liberty, which is probably inappropriately named now, but it seems to me it retains the name Liberty because that's what it's had for over 70 years. But actually they're far more comfortable with the second part of their strapline because they say liberty, protecting civil liberties, promoting human rights. And it's really the promotion of human rights that better characterises that organisation now. That was brought home to me last week when Chami Chakrabarti, their director, perplexed by the possibility that the Human Rights Act might be repealed, said, this is the gravest threat to freedom in Britain since the Second World War. Well, that was about a bill which isn't probably ever going to happen in any event. And if it did, it would only be replaced by something similar. So, that just shows how wedded that organisation is, not to liberty, but actually to rights. She might, of course, have talked about something different, such as Cameron's extremism disruption orders, which is actually legislation which is going to happen. But you only have to say to yourselves, well, what sort of campaigns have been mounted against that, which is legislation that is going to happen, as compared to the possibility of a British Bill of Rights and repeal of the Human Rights Act, which, as I say, if it is going to happen, it's some time off. That really sums up, it seems to me, the culture of rights that we have today. Now, how is this subversion, I would say, of liberty really come about? I want to give you just three notions which I believe have been subverted in recent years. First of all, we've got the rule of law. The rule of law, again, you can trace back to the Magna Carta. It was very much in its nascent form then, but nevertheless you can see the origins of the rule of law. And it's a notion that has traditionally been used to confine the reach of the state. So back in 1215, it was to stop King John from throwing people in dungeons at his own whim and fancy. And it was recognised that if people are to have freedom and liberty, then there needs to be restrictions on the ability of a monarch, as it was then, or the state, more generally as it is now. But the rule of law has been turned on its head. The rule of law is still important, but it depends what you mean now by the rule of law. The rule of law, it seems to me, now has no limits at all. And the rule of law is very much concerned with giving more and more powers to judges. There are a huge number of discretions which are now vested in judges. When people talk about the rule of law now, you're not looking at a particular restriction on what the state can do. On the contrary, you are invariably now talking about a very broad discretion which is vested in the judiciary, who can decide on the part of the state what can and can't happen. So that's another concept that's been turned on its head. Another is the notion of equality. Again, when you look at this timeline, there are a number of struggles that have happened throughout history which are concerned with equality, such as the right for men and women to be treated equally when it comes to voting. Or in America, for example, with the civil rights movement, the right of people of different races to be treated equally. The notion of equality, it's still very important, but it now means something very different from what it has traditionally meant. It now tends to mean some equality of outcome. not a fundamental equality in terms of political formal equality, but more concerned with an equality of outcome. And my third issue, which it seems to me underpins all of these changes, is the way in which the individual is now understood in a wholly different way from how he or she was traditionally understood. So when you had events that granted us more liberty, the individual was understood in terms of the 3 R's, not the 3 that you're thinking about, but the 3 R's in terms of robust, rational, and resourceful. Liberty was important so that the individual had the ability to think and act and organise for himself. In place of the 3 R's, what we now have is the 2 V's. Sorry, I couldn't think of a third one. But my 2 V's are that human rights campaigners and the rights discourse are forever seeing victims and people who are vulnerable. And of course, that leads on naturally to all the other problems I've been talking about invoking the state to protect vulnerable victims. So there is something which is beguilingly misleading about this timeline. Rights campaigners of today believe they are in the tradition that started in 1215. They are not.
Frank.
Yeah, thanks very much. No sooner was the Magna Carta granted to the barons before it was taken away, withdrawn. And I think that the fact that a piece of paper guaranteeing people freedoms could be withdrawn so easily tells us that freedom is always a precious asset that can be taken away. And one of the things that I've learned from my work on history is that you can never take freedom for granted. It's not something that can merely rest on a piece of paper. It's not something that is there for life. There's continually attempts to limit it. There are attempts to redefine it. There are continually attempts to, in a sense, render it empty of any kind of meaning. And that's been the historical experience, for the last 800-900 years. And I think one of the interesting things about the levelers who used to hang around here was that they had a conception of freedom, which was a very radical idea of freedom, which was they understood that freedom was something that you had to struggle for, that you didn't get freedom from somebody else. There's a word we use in the English language, being empowered. The idea of being empowered is a totally irrational concept. Power is never given to you as a little gift. Throughout history, power is taken. It is something that people struggle for. There's never been a significant freedom or a significant right that just been sort of received as an act of God. You wake up in the morning and you're now freer than you were yesterday. It always involved people being prepared to take their freedom seriously. One of the things I love about the levelers was that when they were thinking about issues to do with courts and the making of judgments, they took the view that actually the best judgments that can be made is not in a sense, the deliberation of a judge, somebody that's sitting up there with a big wig and sort of making pronouncements. They look to their peers. They look to other people to kind of come to a decision as to what is right and what is wrong. And I think that a robust idea of freedom, which is something that you live. I mean, freedom is something you have to live, rather than something you kind of can take for granted, is important for us to realize, because actually, if you look at the timeline of the last 800 years, every time you take a step forward, there's always an attempt to push it back. And when you take 2 or 3 steps forward, then you know that it's only a matter of time before those freedoms come into question by some powers or by different kinds of interests. What concerns me today, following on from one point that John made, is that the idea of freedom that motivated and inspired the people in the last 800 years to struggle for freedom seems to have diminished. You see, throughout the last 700 years, people have always believed that freedom ultimately depended on being able to protect yourself from the state. The idea of tolerance, for example, of having your own conscience preserved and protected, required a bit of distance between you and the state, between you and those people who were ruling you. You needed a bit of space within which you could exercise your ability to think for yourself, to express yourself in accordance with your imagination. But as John says, one of the things that has changed is that increasingly, for a variety of reasons, which I haven't got time to go into, we seem to think that freedom is something that you received as a gift from the state. And as an academic and as somebody that's been working in universities, one of the things that really concerns me in Europe, and I'm sure it's a bit like in America as well, is that intellectuals in the 21st century spend more time trying to work out how to limit freedoms than how to increase them. It's a totally new development. I remember reading about radical intellectuals in the last 200-300 years, and they were always in the forefront of expanding freedoms. Well, today, whenever I debate issues to do with freedom in universities across Europe, in Italy or Holland or Germany, I tend to be the only person that's arguing for expanding freedom. All my academic colleagues have got brilliant reasons as to why today freedom is really an extra option, not something you really need to sort of take seriously. And that's something that, in a sense, concerns me quite a bit. And I began to think, well, what's really going on? Why is it that although nobody argues against freedom, I mean, you don't have movements saying, let's get rid of freedoms. Even the most extreme anti-liberal people don't say, sort of get rid of freedom altogether. So nobody argues against it. But at the same time, nevertheless, while this is going on, there seems to be a new attitude towards freedom, something that maybe existed in the past here and there, but has crystallized into a very hard outlook on the world. And the way that I look at it, and it seems to me to be the tragedy of our time, is that both the left and the right, for very different reasons, has adopted a very instrumental attitude towards freedom. People will tell you that they love freedom, but not for him, and not today, maybe tomorrow. Other people will say, we love freedom, but for the sake of our security, in order to protect our countries, we need to introduce a new patriotic act or some other kind of act that circumscribes the freedoms that we had. Other people will say, oh yes, freedom is really, really good, but for people's well-being, we need to limit the freedom that you have as an individual in order that other people's welfare could be protected. And what I call the freedom-security trade-off has become powerful. Now my argument is, and this is something I get from the levelers, but something I get from the experience of the past, is that freedom and democracy is not something that's good for achieving something external to it. Freedom and democracy have got to be taken seriously in its own right. In other words, it's the integrity of freedom that is really at stake. It's the integrity of democracy is important. I talk to people who call themselves liberal and even libertarians, and sometimes, someone like Hayek, for example, argues that democracy is a means to an end. And you meet people on the left who argue, well, democracy is a means for achieving economic welfare. And other people argue, well, democracy is really, really good for the economy. I mean, there's millions of variations on this argument, but democracy and freedom is appreciated only because of what it seems to achieve, not because it's good in and of itself. And that seems to me to violate the fundamental premise of what freedom and democracy is all about. Because I believe that freedom and the exercise of democracy is important for the person. You and I become better people. You and I become conscious citizens. You and I gain responsibility over our affairs and exercise autonomy over our existence because we live freedom. And it seems to me, especially for those of you, the younger generations, that unless you're prepared to live freedom, live for freedom, and not just see freedom as something that is merely a medium for achieving a particular right or a particular benefit or a particular good, a commodity, unless you understand that, freedom becomes threatened from within. And the unique feature of our time is that our freedoms are not threatened by totalitarian Russia or Nazi Germany or this dictator or that. Our freedoms are actually threatened by the fact that we no longer appreciate it as something that needs to be valued in its own terms. And 800 years after the Magna Carta, I think that's the message that we've got to think about, reflect upon, and live for.
Thank you very much. Gene.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for including me in this discussion. I don't disagree with anything our previous two speakers have said in the sense that the view, I think, is much the same in our country of where freedom stands, where democracy is going, and the concerns about limits now rather than expansive nature of freedom. For many academics and many lawyers, and many people in the profession, it is that crystallizing moment for many of the concepts that underlie the American Revolution, the American approach to what we call the First Amendment, the 5 freedoms that are enshrined in our 45 words. But it's 45 words, so be suspicious of any document that proclaims freedom in more than 50 or 60 words, because you'll find constitutions with thousands of words describing those rights, and they tend to be more repressive the more lengthy the document protecting them, because they build all these conditions in. But I think it's more the lore than the actual law. Really focused in terms of the American experience on religious liberty, the idea of the church not being completely under the direction of the king. There was a brief mention, by the way, of women's rights, but we won't have to go there tonight. Didn't go very far. And then there was the right of petition assembly. And so what we talk about in the U.S. When we talk about the Magna Carta is this idea of being able to speak truth to power, of having that right without the fear of dungeon, at least imminent threat, of being able to talk freely and speak about issues and not be restrained. But frankly, we take them for granted, having them written down. We do a survey every year of these rights that would trace back to the Magna Carta. This year, 2% of Americans could name any of the freedoms, even one, I should say, in the Bill of Rights, and 33% couldn't name any. Now, whether they can formally name them or not, but then we ask a second question, and this will get to the dangers to the liberties that we've talked about already. We ask, since you don't know them, we'll tell you in this survey of adults nationwide, and then we say there are these, and people say, oh ha, and then we say, do they go too far? In your opinion, does the First Amendment go too far in the rights it guarantees? And it's really interesting to see this threat, and again, a thread of our earlier speakers that you'll see in my remarks, because I think the threat today is fear and the manipulation of fear by the political structure. Because 8 months after the 9/11 attacks, what traditionally was somewhere between about 13 and 18% saying it went too far, and that's press excesses 1 year and something another year. You can sort of trace it back to an incident, and the numbers would go up and down. 8 months after 9/11, that number said that we had too much freedom in America, went to 49%, effectively half the country when you fold in the margin of error. And then it began to decline, and it went back down to 13% just a couple of years ago. The bombing at the Boston Marathon, right back up to almost 40%. Now this year, the survey will come out in about a month, but I have some preliminary numbers and it will decline again. What I see there is this fear, this concept of trading security, or the promise of security for your freedoms. The problem is, in our survey, that number varies very quickly. The fear drops away and the number goes back down. We prize our liberties. But laws have a permanence, and they may be exploited. And so as we look at 800 years of this, what Justice Roberts called the ascent toward liberty, what worries me now is that there's this tendency in an era in which fear can be spread so rapidly and so dramatically that we are willing to trade off those 800 years of freedom for this illusion of security. The Knight Foundation, another nonprofit like us, takes our survey of adults and does it for high school students, and they do anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million high school students around the country. And in all of those years that they've done that survey, there's a very high percentage, sometimes as high as 70% of students, who will say that it's okay for the government to look at news articles in advance, just to check for accuracy, or to avoid, issues of defamation. And there was one place, and a lot of commentators made fun of it, but in a column that I do, I supported it. Suddenly you had 75 and 80% of young people saying that they strongly support the right of musicians to sing lyrics or perform songs that might offend anyone. You know, if you look at American schools today, we had a court judge in 1969 called Tinker, where they said that you don't leave your rights as a student at the schoolhouse door, that you carry them into the classroom. We've now spent the better part of 50 years rolling back that court decision little by little. So students today in our schools are often taught to sit down, shut up, and you'll get your rights back with your diploma as you pass out the door into the world. And so I'm not surprised that in many ways they don't stand up for liberty, for individual rights. because they're being shown it by example, and we do a lousy job of teaching about it. But where do they have a sort of sense of freedom, of that liberty, that personal freedom? It's in music. So the experience of having it is what I think speaks to your point about the benefit to the individual. They see that as an intrinsic right to say what they will or to hear the music that has a message that resonates, that challenges authority. And so where liberty is practiced, where liberty is taught, where liberty is defended, for the moment still in popular music, young people appreciate it. And so you have this, I think, a great lesson in a rather mundane way of the value of liberty. We see now in the last, I would say in the States since the mid-70s, the rise of this desire to be protected from, by the government rather than from the government itself. A complete reversal of the history of the First Amendment. And by the way, even the Bill of Rights having 220 years, really the First Amendment law in America rose in the early 1900s. Up until that time, there wasn't, frankly, a great deal of legislation or litigation around it. So it's still a rather new experiment in the United States, but we're beginning to see this defense of individual speech, defense of against repression turned into you can't print or say or hold a meeting about the cartoons involving the Prophet Muhammad because that would be dangerous, that would be provocative. There was a shooting most recently, and I'll close with this observation. There was a shooting in Garland, Texas, where the police intercepted two men who were apparently going to cause violence at a deliberately provocative meeting, admittedly, in which the cartoonists were invited to draw cartoons. After the incident, a great many First Amendment defenders, normally, people who would call themselves liberals, people who would call themselves advocates of free speech, said, oh, that meeting should never have been held, that they should never have been under the law allowed to have such a meeting because that would be offensive to some. And I and a few others wrote that it was absolutely imperative that they be allowed to have that meeting. Not that violence was the appropriate response, but that the antidote to speech that we don't like is more speech, not less. In 1948, we had a Supreme Court justice who wrote an opinion, something I use now as sort of, he referred to the First Amendment as a North Star, a guiding principle. And he wrote that at times we need to hear that which we don't like, which may offend or even repulse, in order to be motivated to speak out against it and to truly know that which opposes. And I think that concept goes all the way back to this idea, granted 25 barons, 30 days worth of law, a bit ephemeral, but it was that idea of speaking truth to power, of having that right as an individual intrinsically to express oneself. And so I think for us, it is that concept, again, more law perhaps than law, that has driven much of the American experience, and I hope will still be that North Star to preserve liberty in the States.
Thank you all very much. 100 years ago, on the 700th anniversary of the Magna Carta, it was actually in the midst of the First World War. The Magna Carta was actually seen as an inspiration for further constitutional change, and people actually argued for more democracy, votes for women, more freedom. You've, I think, charted very well how pessimistic people today are about freedom, so there's a real difference. Both of you referred to the security, fear, and its impact on freedom, and I was just wondering, like, what is the key thing that has changed? Is it to do with security and fear, which you both talked about, or is it more to do with our view of the individual?
Well, I think you're wrong about 1915, because it's precisely in the First World War that these very strong anti-liberal ideas also began to develop in parallel with the suffragette movement, with the struggles for different freedoms. So there's a parallel movement going on. And that's what I meant earlier on, that freedom is never black or white. There's always a struggle that goes on. And it just so happened that in the interwar period, you had some of the most horrible anti-liberal movements emerging, as well as some of the most inspiring ones going in parallel. I think the defining political moment that we live through at the moment is that liberalism, in its classical sense, is dead. I mean, if you look at Europe, there are no liberal parties. The Liberal Democratic Party in this country is about as liberal as, as the old Conservative Party was. But probably the old Conservative, I'm doing a disservice to the old Conservative Party, because at least they had a basic liberal instinct. The Liberal Democrats are entirely pro-state, manipulate the life out of humanity kind of parties. So there is no liberal party. All the liberal parties in Europe have been vanquished or marginalized. Libertarianism is generally understood as this narrow obsession with the free market, and nothing to do with what real libertarianism is, which is really about sort of freedom and believing in human beings and in moral autonomy, moral independence, which is what gives libertarianism its power historically. So all that's gone. The left and the radical left has imploded and has got barely any kind of existence. So if you look around Europe, there is no movement for freedom, except in very specific circumstances for very limited types of freedom. And if you have a political culture where freedom is only a rhetorical accomplishment, but it's got no real weight behind it, then it's not particularly surprising that the ideals, the tired old ideas that, oh yeah, freedom is too much to bear, because freedom is not an easy thing to live with. I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre, for all his sin, explained in his kind of idea of existentialism that freedom is not something that is a pleasurable experience. I mean, freedom's got all kinds of responsibilities. It's a struggle. It's an inner struggle as well as that with other people. And in the absence of movements that genuinely believe in freedom, it's not surprising that the ideas of liberty, genuine liberty, has diminished in its significance. And and I think it's sad that you need to have the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta to get public figures to talk about freedom. I mean, they've been sleeping. They've been like sleeping for the last 100 years. All of a sudden, Magna Carta, we can talk about freedom. It's safe because it was 800 years ago.
That's an interesting question. I think that security and liberty issue is there. In some ways, the security issue is merely a tool to this larger wave. And the good thing about talking about an 800-year-old document is you can look at these sort of sweeps. And I think classic liberals who would freedom from government today is muted into using government to achieve in the short term what they're not willing to wait for in the long term. So government has become a tool now to take a shortcut. And the problem is, I think, as one of our earlier speakers, forgive me, but pointed out, rights that can be extended by the government can be withdrawn by the government. And without really approaching the sort of underlying issues that surround real freedom, which is messy and difficult and requires engagement. It's an irony at a time, to me, when the world is ever most connected and it's easier for all of us to talk to everyone else, we disengage. We narrow our choices on the web. Instead of the serendipity of turning through a newspaper to find stuff we all have an app that tells us the news that we already know or already agree with, the opinions we already agree with. Part of that larger, in effect, almost to me, atmospherics is this idea of protect me from rather than allow me to. One of the great problems I have in speaking about the First Amendment in America is pointing out it is not, if you go to court, it's not you and the government standing there making a petition to the court to decide. You already won the fight. You have all the rights. Government has none, save for the narrow slice that we permit, at least by law, we are supposed to permit it to intrude upon your liberty. You don't stand there equal before the court of public opinion or the court of law. And most Americans don't see it that way. They think they actually have to defend their right of free speech, that the government has a right to silence them unless they defend. It's not a civil case. Parties do not have equal standing. We've won, but we forget that. And by doing that, we cede that territory. I fear well-meaning people much more than the dictator with the armored vehicle down the street, because if we just stop a little bit of that hate speech, if we just stop a little bit of that, these strange and bizarre faiths that are intruding upon the organized religions in America, we'll be just fine. It's a loss. It's only a small percentage of America who will miss it. Well, 1791, Bill of Rights set out the idea that government in America may neither favor nor disfavor religion, and that it is your right to choose whether you'll have faith or not, an organized faith. Today, the largest religions in America by enrollment are Roman Catholics and Baptists of various sects. Those were fringe and extreme faiths. We forget that today. We would rather protect those religions against these rather unusual, or we would permit surveillance of maybe not a direct attack, but we would permit surveillance of Muslims, or we would rule out certain kinds of religious practices because they offend. So it's all of the atmospherics, I fear, that are this concept of protect me from rather than give me the freedom to. And that's really what it comes down to, and I think that was your opening thought.
And John, were you arguing that there is a contradiction between rights and liberty inherently, or were you arguing that it's the discourse today and the way rights are seen today that creates this contradiction?
It's the latter. I mean, one of the problems with all of these concepts is that they can mean so many different things. So, as I said, I have no problem with people talking about Jean's five freedoms, 5 rights. You know, the right of free speech, right of free assembly, and so on and so forth. All of those very important rights, you see, you can't avoid using the word, all of those very important rights are worth celebrating and having. My problem is that the word right has now been stripped of that positive content and now means something completely different, which I summed up with that simple phrase, if you like, rather than freedom from the state, it's now about protection by the state. I think one of the points I wanted to try and get across is that it's very important to define your terms, because I think so many people are very slippery these days. I mean, it's like Frank was saying, no one campaigns against freedom. But people pay lip service, even lip service to the notion of liberty. But they do it in such a way that shows that they don't really understand the meanings of these words. They use them in ways which, for 750 years of human freedom, they have meant something completely different. And you asked the question, Helena, about whether the problem is, is it about security and fear, or is it about the way we understand the individual? Well, for me, the key concept here is, what is our notion of the individual? Because I don't think you can have freedom unless you have a certain idea of the individual, namely an individual who is open to reason and persuasion and open to accepting and understanding the right thing. Now, the problem is our policymakers these days have no such concept of the individual. That is why they are not in favour of free speech. They're in favour of its antithesis, namely banning speech. And so everything that informs Cameron's disruption orders and the whole prevent strategy is about not persuading people that actually going off to fight for ISIS is not a good idea. It's about using the coercive force of the law. It's about banning them and forcing them to do this, that, and the other. And what informs that whole approach is a misunderstanding of the human condition. Namely, there is a failure to understand that we, all of us, are open to persuasion and an understanding of what the right thing to do is.
On this thing about rights, I think what's really important about it is that the concept of rights has become totally infantilized. It's almost like a childish outburst, which you get when you hear these records, the right to party, Yeah. It's my right, which basically means that whatever I feel at a particular moment, I can crystallize into a right, and it then becomes hardened. The trouble is that this childish view of a right is actually legitimated by the way that the world has worked. So the United Nations every year fabricates a new human right, or a right to reproduction. I'm totally for abortion on demand and a woman's right to choose, but a human right, that's stretching the meaning of right. And if you look at the United Nations and the list of new rights, it's really like a potpourri of the latest fad or the latest prejudice, which then is kind of re-represented in a language of jurisprudence. So I would say that the lesson is very simple: more freedoms, more liberty, but far less rights. I think that we already have far too many rights, and I would rather struggle for the real rights, the ones that are really crucially important, rather than for this childish, sort of immature, sort of outbursts, which then become legalized and turn into these horrible rights.
Okay, so now it's your turn.
What occurs to me as thinking of the English political history is that the Enclosures Act, through the peasants, which had them their means of livelihood that was free, the commons was free to them to make their life. And that was taken away from them in the Enclosures Act, and they were thrown out of their own power and into the urban cities. And most of us now live in urban cities, don't we? And we don't have those means anymore by right to make our own libertarian lives in the same way. So this, I think, may be at the root of this change into a sort of statist view of establishing our rights again.
David Cameron recently made some remarks, and they were followed by Theresa May, concerning the proposed bill for restraining orders and such like against what he calls non-violent extremists. He's on record as saying that such people, non-violent extremists that is, are just as dangerous as terrorists, which is quite an extraordinary thing to say. Does the panel believe that this is the beginning, this proposed bill is the beginning of tyranny? I believe it is. And if they do think so, then are there any proposals for perhaps some concerted effort as a nation, as a group, to do something positive about opposing these draconian, unreasonable and unprecedented attacks on free speech?
Three great speeches. Question for you, John, being a bit of devil's advocate. Your 3 R's about, I think, was robust, rational, resourceful, very much the classical liberal language. And then when you get up to a situation where the modern liberals complain about the fact that capitalism has created material problems, ghettos of poverty, that there's not a level playing field for poor working class kids, and the state needs to intervene to create the conditions where those kids can have a fair crack of the whip in life. What's your position on that? Does that come under protection, or does that come under a progressive state action? It's the classical versus modern liberal argument. Frank, this point about not just a means to an end is a fantastically interesting point, and I'd like you to expand on that. And strangely enough, the guy who asked the question about enclosures, I read a brilliant article of yours in Spect about 2 weeks ago about Milton. I think it was around about 1643 and about the importance of freedom and conscience. Was it not only 5 years later, if I'm right, or 4 or 5, in 1647, when the diggers did the business and started a mass campaign and political action and struggle based on some of the ideas of people like Milton? And my point is it just that freedom, you live freedom as you say, and that's it? I can't stop thinking that there might be something else, but maybe I'm wrong. And Jean, just to be really devil's advocate, the only possible point in the three speakers I might disagree with, which is about rights stopping at the front door for students. I think it's a good thing that they stop at the front door, and this is about the question of authority that I want to pose to, and the fact that adults know more, and as part of the socialization process, sometimes students maybe just have to shut up and listen to the adults who know more.
Could I ask your view on 2 recent cases where I've ended up discussing freedom with people? The first is this gay cake case where we have a homosexual couple who were not baked a cake promoting gay marriage by a pair of Christian bakers. And when I was discussing freedom around that case, it seemed to me that what people were talking about was really the freedom to be treated equally. But it's something very different to what we might have once thought of as equality before the law. Because equality before the law might once have meant that we are all treated the same by the institutions of the state. But today it seems that equality before the law is more akin to equal recognition by organs of the state, which I think has part of its lineage in the Equalities Act that John, you spoke about. And then the freedom to marry, because that's one that's been hotly discussed recently. And again, it seems to me that that debate is not so much about freedom from the state or freedom from the law. It seems to me something very different, and the freedom to access a traditional institution. Where does the interaction between freedom and tradition lie in this discussion?
Yeah, just a quick one. And the Magna Carta, most of it was about protecting us from money lenders, wonga owners, financial scammers and usurers. And it's all been repealed. Most of it's been repealed. So your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions. I can't really answer them all. The importance about freedom is that it isn't just something that you live for in a passive kind of a way, but the very act of being a free citizen imposes upon you a responsibility for the communities that you're living in. And that also relates to a point that was raised over here, which is that although we live in an urban society, that doesn't mean to say that people cannot have a liberal or an open-minded community of people who take their citizenship seriously. I think the real tragedy has been is that in the last 100 years in particular, the right to make decisions that in a sense imposes itself upon freedoms has become depoliticized, has become a matter entirely for the courts, and then ultimately, because it's a matter for courts, has become a business of the state. So in a sense, it's the depoliticization of all the activities that surround freedom and the debates and the discussions that need to be had that in a sense make it so difficult for this to occur. Can I just say about the gay cake business? I mean, I could go on about the other case as well. I think that's a very interesting case. And I think from a genuinely, sort of libertarian point of view, you'd have to argue that the people who, as I understand, they were private bakers. They ought to have the right to make decisions in accordance with their conscience, regardless of sort of who the customers are. They could pay a big price for it in business terms, in that they would lose a lot of customers. On the other hand, if they were a public bakery, or if they were subsidized by public finances, then they would be obliged, I think, to kind of provide services in equal measure to every person. I think it's this public-private distinction that's quite important.
Yeah, just following on from that, because I agree with you on the gay cake issue. And you might remember that case of Lilian Liddell, the Islington, I think that's the right name, isn't it? The Islington registrar, who refused to officiate in a civil partnership. The point I'd make about that is that I think she had a perfect right to say, no, this is against my beliefs. I am not going to civil partner a gay couple. She had that right so long as Islington Council was able to find replacements for her. In other words, this is, I think, Frank's point, that the public service could be provided and the public service could accommodate to her particular beliefs. If, however, this had been a registry office in the middle of nowhere, where they only had one registrar, then it seems to me she should have been sacked, because then the service could not be provided. So that's how I reconcile those two issues. So essentially the individual conscience is exceedingly important, but equally the provision of a service is important. I mean, that's the ridiculous thing about these gay cake cases. If they had wanted their gay cake, they could have walked up the road and got another baker to do their gay cake. It's like that B&B case. The gay couple who weren't allowed to stay in the B&B hotel because it was run by Christians with traditional beliefs. All they had to do was walk up the road and find another bed. I mean, and this is where, coming back to Luke's question about equality before the law, you see, I think it's possibly worse than you've suggested with the wording you used, Luke, because I actually think now, if you look at the Equality Act, there are 6 classes of person who have protected characteristics. They are treated as favoured people by the state, and that's why they believe they can demand a particular service, regardless of anyone else's beliefs, and so on and so forth. So, my view on equality is that I believe in equality, formal equality. It's a very important foundational principle for any democratic state. But what that means is you get rid of any laws which discriminate. So, for example, men and women should be entitled to vote on the same terms. In America, you can't discriminate between blacks and whites, or in any country. But once you've done away with all those discriminatory laws, that's it. You don't need any other laws that promote the particular rights of people. And Kevin's point about, I know you're playing devil's advocate, but it is an important point. A lot of people will say, some people need a helping hand. Well, I don't agree, actually. I think everyone needs to be free to find their own level. And so long as there is no discrimination in a formal sense, then that satisfies that requirement.
The enclosure argument you raised was in the United States called the free range argument, that ability for Americans to move west, to reinvent themselves, in a sense, to have economic security by leaving the urban centers and moving west. When that was lost and closed, a great deal of freedom was lost. I think that lost a little traction in the internet era, because I think the intellectual capacity to both be an entrepreneur and to share ideas in a way that was no longer restrained, forgive me, by the editors and journalists and others who control the press. From a First Amendment standpoint, I think that it was an interesting spin now that we can reach out to the planet from our home with an idea or a concept, and as we're increasingly finding, an economic opportunity. So it is an interesting wrinkle today because of technology. And somebody mentioned Milton. One of the provisions, again, that we sort of cite in more lore than fact is Areopagitica, where there was the concept of the marketplace of ideas. And a couple of observations. One, government doesn't get to say who has a stand in the marketplace of ideas. Secondly, you're not permitted to burn somebody else's stand down as a competitive measure. You compete. To get to the direct question about schools, there's an increasing use of government as this provision against failing, against competing and failing. It's that where all the children in a game get honorable mention. We're afraid to allow people to fail. And so when I talk about the lack of rights now in American schools, a couple of concerns. One, so you make a mistake, you challenge the right. The older I get, I do believe more in the wisdom of the aged, by the way. But this ability to be wrong, this ability to commit an error or to offend an adult, and then be led properly, one hopes, to this idea of here's what's wrong with that. Classic American principle: closed down the newspaper, fired the newspaper advisor, and removed all the students from a student newspaper because they wrote a story about what they had learned in America about your absolute constitutional right to burn an American flag in political protest. He was a Vietnam veteran, he didn't like it, and he shut it all down. And I remember writing, wouldn't it have been better to have the students suggest to them another issue on why people felt so strongly that that was not something you should do, if they were implying that it was endorsement? No, the answer was to shut it down, silence it. One of the issues for gay rights in America, the gay marriage issue, is that it doesn't come out of the ether. It comes against a history in our country of discrimination for racial and ethnic groups. And it plays out against that. So when we talk about the gay cake issue, it's almost, again, not so much law, but the atmospherics that our country has this deep tradition, frankly, of discrimination. And in its most horrible face, in slavery. I'll also say that it gets much more complicated for us because there's actually a case, if you were in New York City, you go down the street, there's 12 other bakers ready for your business. You live in Fargo or South Dakota or some place in Montana where the nearest baker is 700 miles away. Is that an undue burden then? That you have to go 7 miles? I would say, well, serve pizza, don't serve cake. But if you have to drive 700 miles for a cake, should that be somehow recognized different in law?
So, a question for Jean. I wondered if you care to comment on Guantanamo Bay and cruel and unusual punishments, and give us the reference for that phrase. The level of incarceration of blacks, especially black youth, is often a popular subject in the States, 2 million. And finally, we could talk about habeas corpus and things like that, but perhaps the drone program for eliminating American citizens included. Wondered if you just care to comment, if you can, on those three live issues in the US.
This is a general question for the panel. I'm sure many of you were sickened, as I was, by the anti-democratic protests that took place in London on May the 8th following the result of the election. But as you were saying in the panel, as we all appreciate the idea of democracy and freedom being married together, when a majority of the population is voting against ideas of freedom, for example, scrapping the Human Rights Act, for example, bringing in the new counter-extremism bill, how on earth can we therefore argue for a continuation of such freedoms against a democratic mandate otherwise? The second question is, how can we translate English rights and liberties to a modern UK?
I'd just like to see you guys disagree a little bit more. So let's throw one in, where the state has to make hard and practical choices to protect people from each other. And just to help, I'll offer the issue of firearms control, see if we get some split on the panel.
Question for John. You were saying things had changed perhaps in the last 50 years, and I wondered whether, certainly in Europe, in Britain, that was an influence of Europe, where the legal system is completely different from the UK, loosely described as in the UK you can do anything as long as it's forbidden, but in Europe you can only do things that are permitted. And this produces a completely different slant on things.
So I went to the exhibition as well. There's this striking picture in the whole thing about King John and Shakespeare. Enormous picture of Shakespeare's representation of King John leaning back in his chair, just being evil to everybody, killing his nephew, throwing him out of a window, attached to a rock and all sorts of stuff, But everything, freedom from the state that you're alluding to, John, is freedom from this despot, the barons, or later freedom from other kings who are doing things to you, locking you up and all this kind of bad stuff. Then it's freedom from Parliament, it's the idea of the Magna Carta is used later on as an argument against Parliament and its authority. And you do wonder whether King John's won in the sense that who wants freedom from the state? I mean, you're either employed by the state, you're treated by the state, People talk about whether the state can help, the poor in society. Who wants freedom from the state and the authority? So you do wonder whether you're saying, is the choice security or is it the weakened individual? Well, I'll posit a third possibility, which is the God-given authority of the state to rule us, which is what we have now. We are back to the kings of before. The state it's unquestioned that the state that has the authority to rule over us. It's almost like we don't need freedom.
A couple of you have talked about equality, and I just think I'm wondering if it poses a bigger problem, because when I listen to like academics at the universities who are arguing things that are curtailing freedom, I wonder how do you sleep at nights in what you're saying? And it seems to me that the thing that they always say is that that's the price you pay for equality, and I'm getting sick of talk of level playing grounds. I think let's have some valleys and hills and see how people do as they try and climb them and stumble. Maybe I'm just a horrible person, but I do think that the problem with equality is, I think it just at a really fundamental level, I think it just stops you seeing what's actually happening. Because the other day when I said to somebody that I don't think there's such a thing as racism in Britain anymore, which I really don't think that there is, I was really called obnoxious and said, well, how can you say that when, I know somebody that was stopped by the police 20 times and he's black. And I'm not denying that those things happen, but I don't think it exists as a systematic way of organising things in the way that racism did. So that equality thing kind of stops you seeing reality, and it does also seem to be today, in the way John was outlining, much more like entitlement. The access is not it's not access in the sense of the way Kant talked about the state and church providing the bare structures, and then the individual got on with things and they'd work our own way out of barbarism. It's more about entitlement in your personal life, not just your public persona.
Why has this Enlightenment idea of the robust, rational and resourceful idea of the person decayed? Does it date from a particular historical point? And perhaps more importantly, how do we reaffirm it going forward?
We were really interested in your point about personal freedom in music. And it certainly made me wonder, I'm sure the guys with me, well, is it an example of civil society actually asserting an idea of what freedom should be? Just one example amongst many.
Jean, you mentioned about how the internet was seen as a sort of great advance for free speech. I was wondering what you thought about the concentration of online communication, like a smaller and smaller number of private corporations like Facebook and Twitter. And what we're seeing now is that there's a lot of pressure on them from activists to adopt more stringent regulations on free speech within their platforms.
Very interesting question here about difficult questions that the government has to address, because often rights can conflict. I think it's well summed up by that expression that your right to throw a fist ends at the point of my nose. That's one of the problems with rights, and that's why I'm not in favour of any of these rights being codified into hard and fast laws. That, incidentally, is why personally I wouldn't even go along with the American Bill of Rights, because a number of reasons. One is that it tends to shunt these questions off to the judiciary, but the other is actually I don't think there is a single right that you can codify as a hard and fast, unvariable rule. For polemical purposes, I'm often quite happy to say that free speech is an absolute right, but it isn't, because there are certain things that need to be protected, such as the right of confidence. If you see a blind man walking towards the cliff face, it is not right to shout, "Walk on." But what's interesting about that is the exception to the rule tells you why we have the rule. The reason why free speech is so important is because it recognises the right of the individual to think and act for himself. Now, that example I've just given you of the blind man walking towards the cliff face, if you shout "walk on," he has no means or no ability to decide whether or not that's right. He has to accept what you say. Exactly the same applies when you shout fire in a crowded cinema. The point is, the point I'm making is that there are certain principles that are worth defending and celebrating. So with free speech, the underlying principle is essentially the right of the individual to think and act for himself. But then you try and codify that into a hard and fast law, and it becomes problematic. So that's why you ask a good question, and I agree that there are also compromises that need to be drawn. Where you draw these compromises is a very difficult issue. But so long as that debate is informed by the right principles, the chances are you'll come out with an acceptable solution. As it happens, since you want some controversy on this panel, I am not in favour of allowing individuals to carry firearms. Now, I accept that in America there is a very different culture, and it may well be that in America that is the right thing, but I, personally, that's not the road I would want to walk down. On your question about the last 50 years, and is it all to do with those Europeans with their dastardly views of law and so on? Well, I don't think it is, actually, because actually I think in many European countries you can see there's been a very good tradition of liberty recognised for many centuries. And I also think that the European Convention of Human Rights is interesting in this regard, because it was ratified in 1950. For about 30 years, no one ever took any notice of it. I mean, you would hardly have known it even existed. And in fact, when it did give occasional judgments, some of them were actually quite good, such as when it took the side of the Sunday Times that was trying to expose the thalidomide scandal. It's only post about 1980 it's become problematic, because it has grossly aggrandized itself. It's expanded its reach and it's become far more interventionist. Now, the question is, why is that? I don't think it's Europe. I think it's more to do with culture, and it's because we no longer have so much confidence in ourselves to manage and govern ourselves, so we're more inclined to shunt these issues off to the wise, noble, pure, elite judiciary. And that, I think, is the problem. It's essentially a cultural and political problem rather than anything to do with Europeans.
Two disagreements. I think John is always right, but free speech is an absolute. I mean, I'm a free speech absolutist, and I can explain to you why that is afterwards, because it's a long process, especially in the 21st century when everybody is equivocating on it. I'm not a believer in arms control and gun control. I think that gun control laws basically empower the authorities and assume that tyrannical actions will never occur, and disempower the rest of us. So I know it's in America there are people who believe in not regulating, many people that believe that you shouldn't regulate the ownership of guns. In Europe, that's not a very popular position. I'm probably the minority one in this room. But there are places like Switzerland and elsewhere where people understand that democracy does depend upon an active citizenry being able to defend itself. I just want to take up one point. I think the point about King John being still alive is utterly wrong. And I don't think that the way that the whole issue of the security and democracy trade-off, I suppose, sort of captures the essence of the matter. So one of the important developments that has occurred is that the state in almost every society in the West very rarely presents itself as the state. Right? I mean, the state is an abstraction, it's always been an abstraction, but whereas in the past the state outwardly sort of talked about its authority, either through divine kingship or in a parliamentary democracy. Today, what the state does routinely is it depoliticizes every issue to do with welfare, every issue to do with rights. And the way that the state works is precisely, but not by being King John, but being this provider of provisions, a provider of goodies for people, providing welfare, and a variety of other kind of resources. And it does that not by speaking as the state, but by outsourcing its authority to experts, and it's the experts, public health officials, who tell us, how to behave, what we need to do. It outsources it to scientists. It outsources it to a whole large number of depoliticized bodies like the Bank of England, who make financial policy and are not accountable to the democratic populace. And of course, the worst manifestation of that is Europe. Not Europe, but the EU. I love Europe. The EU I can do without. Where the EU is a law into itself, and where you have more experts in Brussels than rats, all of them making profoundly important political decisions that affect the basic dimensions of our life. And I think when that occurs, when these resources become depoliticized, it's not surprising that people have no idea that they've just given up their freedom. People do not understand that their freedoms has been lost to these depoliticized expert institutions that govern the minutiae of our affair. I did an article last week in Huffington Post about this poor woman, a Jehovah's Witness. I'm an atheist, so I've got no particular links with Jehovah's Witnesses, but her 7-year-old child was taken away because she was socializing the child in her own views. She was apparently indoctrinating her child in her religion. And when I talked about this to people, nobody had the least bit of sympathy for this mother. Nobody could understand the enormous damage that was being done to that family and to the violation of those kinds of individual rights. And the reason for that is because parenting and child rearing have been taken over by all these expert bodies, depoliticized, to the point at which nobody is aware of the fact that they've lost some very elementary, very basic freedoms to do with the intimate dimensions of their everyday experience.
On the drones, Guantanamo, and incarceration, you moved me outside the First Amendment, but I would think that the drone program to me is an affront, in part because it dehumanizes these very horrible acts that occurred during war. Guantanamo and the incarceration of many minorities in America is simply a travesty, but it gets more into other areas than the First Amendment in terms of protection, with the exception it touched a bit on the right of assembly, the right to gather in some cases, gang members and others who are arrested simply for associating. At least two appreciated freedoms in our surveys, assembly and petition, are so important because they do establish, at least for in law and in practice, we have the conservative Tea Party and the liberal Occupy movement. This idea that if you assemble and petition the government, you still have that right of ownership, ultimately, of policy. That you may not be prevented from going after and making changes, depending on how effective you are, how the strength of the will of the individual to persevere. And civil rights movement and the suffragette movements in our countries, the rights of immigrants have rested on this right of petition and assembly. So there it is a First Amendment question on who ultimately holds the power. Oh, the internet, yes, terribly concerned about it. And this is what happens with new technology. The minute this new technology allows us to express ourselves in new and different ways that frighten those in power, they attempt to restrict it. You just know that the first caveman had just finished drawing when somebody showed up from the Neanderthal Office of Artistic Impression and said, no, you can't paint that animal, paint that genitalia over, whatever. There had to be a bureaucrat who showed up at that moment. So my hope is that we got such a taste of the possibilities of the internet that we will resist this temptation that even in consolidation in private hands, we will provide for that freedom of expression. The debate on net neutrality in America is much like that. Again, another 6 or 7 hour discussion later, but I am very concerned about it.
Yeah, it seems to me that the protection of free speech and upholding civil liberties is an entirely kind of right-wing concern. I'm interested, how does the left, or can the left, reconnect to that tradition that we've talked about, the diggers and the levelers?
It says in the Magna Carta, justice delayed is justice denied. I want the panel's thoughts on our present system where people can be bailed, rebailed. I was put on bail for 2 years before it concluded. So I feel very strongly about it, that 2 years of my life went for absolutely nothing at all.
I'd like to welcome our friends from America and elsewhere to the London Borough of Wandsworth, where I've lived. And I'd like to comment, since you came here, you never saw any policeman with a gun, right? But in America, the amendment that the right to bear arms, and with technology happening now that you can download a weapon, do you not think, as young people, we can't give all children matches, yes? That it's time that you change that amendment and regulate that, because it's not the wild, wild west anymore. You don't have to fear snakes or cougars or Indians for that matter, if I can be that extreme, yes? There's no need to bear arms. That right needs to go. The freedom is there in the States now, but can you change those laws and civilize your young selves?
I think it's actually somewhat of a misconception around the world because there's such a vigorous lobby in favor of firearms. And I have to only say that my experience in Europe in the 1980s, for example, was that I was shocked to see people carrying automatic weapons in airports, where most of our policemen for years had carried a handgun. Now, that's not just a caliber distinction. It was an uptick in this necessity to arm oneself. And again, fear, I think, is the great motivator here, and that's been inflamed in the United States by a very small lobby of people I think see economic benefit in the sale and maintenance of firearms. So most Americans, I don't believe, own a firearm, and there's a great sentiment against it. And as I always point out in my line of work, if you have a gun, you can probably say what you want, but that is not free speech. That's something else.
I think that gun ownership is a basic right that was won as a result of important political struggle. And if you give that up, then you're giving up something very important. It's not because I fetishize guns. I haven't got one. I'm not into guns. But I know that if you get rid of guns, the consequences will be far worse than the situation now. On your question about the right and freedom, I think something that puzzles me as well, outwardly, but actually when you scratch the surface, you'll find that the reason why certain sections of the right, sort of are for liberty, is because very often they've lost the cultural war, and for them having the freedom to speak out is actually far more important than for anybody else. One of the things that I find, because I've got a lot of right-wing friends who, who I kind of talk to and debate with and discuss, is that although they talk a lot about liberty, and liberty this and liberty that, they're actually, when you scratch the surface, just as selective about their commitment to freedom as the left is. And that's the tragedy. It just so happens that, sort of the freedoms that they like or not like is different than on the left. So, people on the right very often want immigration control and are very vociferous about the need to, sort of do certain things. When you actually talk to them about abortion rights, for example, they're not very relaxed about the woman's right to choose. So what I've noticed is that, sort of there is very little difference between the two sides, which is a tragedy. The only good thing about the right at the moment, and it's only a temporary moment because that may well change, is that because of their position, they are forced to speak up for freedom, for liberty, in its kind of outward general kind of sense. But I think what is really important is that we've got to be very careful about the labels we use, because just as Gene was, people that Gene calls liberals in America, are about as liberal as my kind of right-wing grandmother, and I wouldn't know what liberalism genuinely meant. So to the right-left distinctions, the idea of who's a progressive, all these things are really confused. And I think that the old political vocabulary actually mystifies the reality of the situation. And therefore, it is our job to kind of demystify that to some extent, because what's really important is not the label, but sort of what's being suggested, what's being argued. Somebody raised a very important question about this demonstration after the election. And I was quite, I really felt that was a wrong thing to do. Because people have just voted in a government, and I thought the idea that you go and demonstrate as if somehow, sort of you're operating on the moral high ground was a little bit rich. Having said that, I do accept the right to demonstrate. And if a government was elected that I didn't like and I felt was dangerous, I would go out on the streets as well and demonstrate. There's nothing really wrong with that. But what is really worrying is not that they demonstrated, but what is really worrying is the contempt that some of these people have for ordinary people who voted in that election, and the kind of paternalistic way in which people are regarded is really bad. Let me give you an example just to end on. In Ireland last week, an overwhelming majority of people voted for gay marriage. The one area that didn't vote for gay marriage was a place called Roscommon. I don't know if I pronounced it right. And the minute it was noted that Roscommon didn't vote for gay marriage, a campaign began to boycott Roscommon. That somehow we should really, sort of isolate them. And I thought that was, not only was that old-fashioned collective punishment, because you're basically, sort of holding everybody to account, but what you're also saying is that you, when you go and put your secret ballot and vote, have got to pay a price if you don't vote the right kind of a way. In other words, what they were really saying is that it's not enough to change the law. We need to be able to change your mind. You have to change your attitude. It's a social engineering impulse, so you have to become just like we are. I agree with you about this 2-year business. It's happening quite a lot in this country, and the way in which the police are using this kind of delayed law is very insidious, because it's not just an institutional mistake. It's a way of sending a message. It's a way of crucifying people. It's a way of exposing people to what they think is humiliation and shame. And I think the law should not be used to send a message. It should be used to bring about justice.
On this question of the left and the right and their attitude to liberty, I just think these terms are, their ability to explain what's happening in the world these days has diminished, really, because I don't think the right wing has ever really believed in liberty. I think what they have tended to believe in is the market, and hence they have not wanted a particularly big state. And I think that's well summed up by President Reagan when he once said, one of the most terrifying things an official can ever say to you is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And, you know, I have a certain sympathy with that. It does resonate with me, but I think that sums up the right-wing approach to the state. It's very much about trying to get the state out of things. What it is not in favour of is a celebration of the individual and of personal autonomy. And traditionally, I think the left wing has had more of that. But now, you just can't see it. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I mean, if you look at, say, we had the Blair government, and then we had a coalition government, and now we've got a Tory government, and we know what it's going to do. I mean, in terms of liberty, continuity is the word, isn't it? You know, whether it's left or right, there is no real recognition of the importance of or the reason for liberty. So I just think we have to start building a new tradition.
Can we thank the speakers, please? Fascinating.